Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who didn't join the previous webinar, my name's Nicole. I'm with the environmental organization Urgewald. In this session, we'll be hearing from Jacey Bingler, Urgewald Communications Manager. But now over to the speaker.
So my name is Jacey. I'm in charge of English-speaking media at Urgewald, and I would like to start by taking you on a very brief digital walk through my neighborhood in Berlin. I took these pictures last week in what is usually one of the busiest parts of town. It's hard to tell from the pictures, but these 4 empty billboards are essentially right next to each other. So they're pretty much in a row. In the 5 years I've lived area, and I've anything like that. And I don't have any data to back that up with yet. But my assumption is that a lot of brands are currently moving their out-of-home advertising budgets into the online realm, which brings us to the topic of today's talk. You might recognize the banner, Love and Rage and PR in the Times of Corona, or how to try and raise awareness from your computer. And I would like to stress that I think that you at Extinction Rebellion are already doing an amazing job when it comes to reaching a lot of people, both offline as well as online. So I'm not here by any means to try and enlighten you on how to do proper online campaigning, but I would rather like to share a few tools and tips and tricks that have been working well for us in the past couple of weeks. And I hope that some of the ideas that I will be sharing as part of this conversation may help you to think of new ideas, or that some of what we've been using may be applicable to what you're working on. So if we're talking about reaching a lot of people online, specifically on social media, we can't really get past Facebook. So let me show you a tool that I find really helpful, which is the Facebook ad library. And I would like to stress that you do not have to have a Facebook account. And if you have one, you don't have to be logged in to be able to see the data that I'm going to show you. What the Facebook ad library allows you to do is, on the one hand, look at a report of any given day in any given country. I chose the UK and I chose April 13th to see an overview of the brands that have been spending the most money on ads and how many ads they had in their library. You could also change the country and the time frame. You can look at an entire month. You can look at 3/4 of a year, etc. What you can also do, and that's even more interesting for what we're working on at the moment, is you can look at specific brands. And in this case, you can look at the banks we've been talking about this week. And as an example, I've pulled up the ads HSBC has been running on Facebook, but also Instagram and Facebook Messenger. And you will also see that HSBC has a lot of different Facebook accounts which they're running ads on. So what the Facebook ad library allows you to do is see the creatives these banks are using, the copy they're using, the language they're using, how they're trying to attract new customers. And here are a few more examples also of Barclays, and here's one of Standard Chartered. Now, granted, a lot of these ads are very specific. They're about cashback programs and credit cards. So not all of this is necessarily too useful for what we're working on. But this example, this webinar that happened yesterday, because I took that screenshot last week, that Standard Chartered Singapore was advertising, you might not have come across this piece of content otherwise, because brands pay Facebook to show their ads to very specific targeted audiences. And if you're not in that audience and they're not sharing that kind of content on their regular Facebook or Instagram page, you might not see it. And something that unfortunately doesn't work is interacting with the ads live. So Facebook doesn't allow you to just click on one of these ads in the ad library and then end up on the real ad where you could comment or react to the ad, interact with it in any form of fashion. That doesn't work, unfortunately, but at least this shows you how banks present themselves to the outside world. This is how they hope to acquire new customers, and I find that incredibly interesting and insightful for campaigns where you might want to intervene in some way. So this is the link to the Facebook ad library. If you can't remember it, you can just type FB or Facebook ad library into any search engine and you're going to end up in the Facebook ad library. So just as a recap, what it allows us to do is essentially see how banks try to acquire new customers. What are the topics they think are going to matter most to potential clients? Where do they try to acquire them? Do they run ads in all of the countries that you also focus your social media efforts in, or do they exclude certain countries? We've learned this week that HSBC, for example, focuses mainly on Asian countries and maybe the UK, but not really the rest of Europe. So by looking at how they spend their advertising budget, what kind of imagery they use, you can learn a lot about how ads want to be perceived by the outside world. And this can also help you tailor your campaigns a bit better, because if you know that a bank is not really spending a lot of time and energy and resources on a certain channel, like Instagram, for example, or a certain country, then if you want to run campaigns where you try to reach existing and potential clients to get them to rethink their relationship with the bank, then you can maybe disregard those channels or those countries as well. This brings us to the next topic. I don't know if interception is really the best expression for what I'm trying to explain. I kind of like it in that regard. So just imagine you were standing in line at a bank and the person in front of you was talking to the bank teller or the bank's employee to inquire about opening a new account or getting a new credit card as an existing customer. And imagine you could insert yourself into that conversation, not creepy at all, I know, by asking a question such as, in the case of HSBC, for example, how come HSBC has almost doubled its investments in fossil fuel companies since the Paris Agreement? Do you think that your money, your savings, are really best kept at that kind of bank? And imagine you could take this conversation, which in an offline world would be witnessed by 3 people, the 3 of you. Imagine you could take that into the online space where potentially everyone who comes across that comment, the question you post under a Facebook or Instagram post, could be seen by everyone who's being funneled onto that piece of content by Facebook's algorithm. Now, even if you can't comment under every single ad a bank is running, you may come across ads every now and then you can use your learnings to basically ask these critical questions, but you can apply the same learnings to a bank's regular social media posts because those are accessible to everyone. But be mindful of your audience. You might know a lot about finance already or about fossil fuels and why investing in fossil fuels is so devastating to the planet. But don't assume that that goes for everyone else. So try to find examples, maybe by looking at the Facebook ad library, to find topics that might resonate with people who know about different things and who are interested in different things. Try to find things that will be understandable. And don't forget that if you are commenting on social media posts, you're not addressing decision makers. The people whose job it is to moderate these discussions and to look at your comments are not the people who are deciding where a bank's investments are going. And in most cases, they will probably not know a lot about the bank's portfolios. And as somebody who's worked on the other side as a social media manager, I think it's incredibly important that we get bombarded with questions. But it's even more important that you give these people the information they need to start a conversation within the bank. The more evidence you give them, the more facts, links, resources, the better they can escalate this discussion up, because that's what needs to happen. The more people ask critical questions and the more people pull out these facts and comment them on bank social media channels, the more the bank will realize that this is a reputation disaster waiting to happen. And if you can start a conversation within the bank by involving the people who have to interact with you, chances are that you can maybe help push policies forward or at least educate people within, while also educating people without who see that conversation on social media. So use links wherever possible and suitable, and also try to coordinate. Make use of the fact that you're a massive movement to react to comments and questions that have already been posted, to give them more visibility, to ask follow-up questions, say, yeah, actually, I would also like to know how this fits into your sustainability strategy. Do you even have one? What is your CO2 footprint, etc.? The more you react to a piece of content, the more visibility it is most likely going to get. Now, let me tell you a bit about the UK Climate Gangster campaign that we kicked off about 10 days ago. And I'm showing you basically a print file of a handout, a flyer that we had a designer produce for us when we were still planning to be able to do a lot of offline campaigning around the 3 big UK banks AGMs. So we are focusing on HSBC, Barclays, and Standard Chartered with our campaigns. However, when we realized that with the COVID-19 crisis, we were most likely not going to be handing out any flyers to anyone, we tried to find ways of making this campaign work online only, pretty much. So what we did was we tried to produce an animation in quotation marks, and you'll see why in a second, that we could share on social media. And we posted that 8 days before HSBC's annual general meeting. This is without sound. There is a version with a voiceover and with music, a full video on our social media channels and our website as well. I highly recommend you watch it because I think it's really fun. This one is just a really, really quick animation. So this is basically what we did to take the key facts from the flyer and make them more interesting to look at, to highlight why we believe our research shows that HSBC is a climate gangster. And what I did was I basically just took the individual elements from the flyer, threw them into a keynote presentation. You could definitely also use PowerPoint for that. I then recorded myself clicking through the presentation using QuickTime's screencast. Then I added everything to iMovie. We had a friend record a voiceover with an American accent, and I purchased a Western country music track for, I believe, 20 euros, and then edited everything together. And I am no editing or design pro by any means. And I know that this example is probably not necessarily very overwhelming, but look at the final result, and you'll see that you can, with hardly any or maybe no budget, because if you can do your own voiceovers and you can record those with your phone, I've spoken into a wardrobe to eliminate echo, and the results have been fine. If you can do your own voiceovers, if you have information you think would be interesting to share, you can produce something pretty interesting and creative with not a lot of knowledge, not a lot of expertise, and hardly any budget. So what we also did to make sure that this video would get seen by more people was put a bit of budget behind it. So we advertised it. We posted this post on Facebook and invested 100 euros a day. That was the spending cap we installed to show it to more people, to get the post boosted. And we also targeted we narrowed down our target audience. So we asked Facebook to only show it to people based in either the UK or Hong Kong, because in HSBC's case, this is where their most important clients or potential clients are based. And after 4 days, the video had already collected close to 80,000 views, which is really good considering that we only spent 100 euros a day, especially since now more than ever, most likely, there are more brands competing for the same eyeballs and the same space. Then during the week leading up to the annual general meeting, we decided to try and take the data that we shared in the video that was a bit more top level and a bit more complex, and break it down and explain in examples why investing in fossil fuels is so terrible. On the left, you can see an article about the dredging of Pyraport. And for those of you who missed Mehidi's talk on Wednesday, go back to that talk because he's going to tell you a lot of details about this massive, devastating project. So that's what we did to highlight that this was one of HSBC's investments. They're funding the dredging, or they're one of the investors of the dredging of that port. On the right is a video produced by, I believe, Channel 4 about RWE and the lignite mine for which villages are probably going to be destroyed. Then this is a story about how BP for the last 50 years pretty much has been working with the local government to renew contracts every time there was a regime change, completely disregarding blatant human rights violations, enforced disappearances, torture of journalists and whistleblowers, etc. And this is part of a story and a report Rainforest Action Network published, where we basically talk about the Alberta tar sands and the protests organized around that. And I don't know if you noticed, but none of the content that we shared was actually produced by us. So if you don't have a lot of time or capacity to work on your own stories or videos, there's usually a lot of amazing content out there already. You can use things other NGOs, other journalists, activists have already shared, And maybe you can add your own information to it and shine a new light on it. This is an overview. Sorry, it's cut in half. These pieces are usually below each other. This is the website or the page we built to encourage people to join our campaign, and where we tell them what they can do if they want to get involved. And you can come up with a very simple version of that and just use a Google Doc, for example, and do as much work as possible to make it as easy as possible for people to share your social media posts or to sign a petition, etc. The more work you can do for them, the more visuals you can provide. Maybe you can already find the Twitter and Instagram handles of other activists or of the banks you want them to mention, etc. And what we also did was give people an overview of the fossil fuel businesses, the companies and the projects each of the 3 banks are invested in or are financing. And you can actually get even more information on each and every one of these projects by just clicking on the description. And it's a pretty long list. It's alphabetically sorted. And we also have it for Barclays and Standard Chartered. So you can, by any means, please use that and pull out the projects you think are most interesting and people need to know about, and try to bring to life the fact that financing of fossil fuels has to end. So today, the day of the AGM, since we couldn't be there in person, we recorded 2 speeches. On the left is Tony, one of our researchers, and on the right is Nicole, who's our host. And Tony also talked about the dredging of Pyroport because it's happening in her home country, Bangladesh. And Nicole spoke about the fact that HSBC has almost doubled its investments in fossil fuels since the Paris Agreement. And we shared this on all our social media channels and asked our community to share it together with us, to also raise our demands and ask questions of the bank, which is something we would usually do in an offline scenario. And here's a bit more input for more digital campaigns. Just because COP has been postponed doesn't mean that the banks can relax. COP26 is going to take place in Glasgow, and that means that the entire world is going to be looking at the UK's financial institutions to see if they're going to get their act together and finally come up with dependable phase-out dates and policies, or if they're going to completely embarrass themselves and fail while the entire world watches. And you need to let them know that that's going to happen. We need dependable phase-out dates now. And if you want to encourage others to look into alternatives, and I think you've already been running similar campaigns at Extinction Rebellion, make sure that there's a conversation around that. I thought that was really important when Hefa pointed that out 2 days ago, that if you want to switch, or if you want to encourage others to switch, let the bank know why you're doing it. Tell them that you're doing it because they're failing on climate, that their policies are just not good enough. And you could also warn them. You could give them an ultimatum, or just say, if you're not going to take the necessary steps, I'm going to switch and I'm going to take others with me. Make sure that they realize that this is not just an individual case of a disgruntled customer, but that there's an entire movement and that people are watching them closely. You can also email the banks with evidence of the investments, their investments in fossil fuels and the projects that they're enabling thanks to their financing. We also have a list of the email addresses you can use to contact each of the 3 banks on the website that I mentioned earlier, and even sample emails you could use if you wanted to, but you could come up with something of your own. And what I would find very interesting to do is to ask the banks to share their climate impact with you, and not just the CO2 footprint of running the bank's business, because then they're most likely going to tell you, all of our offices are powered by renewable energy sources, and every time our employees fly, we offset the emissions. Now, if a bank, like in the case of Barclays, for example, has put financing worth of $118 billion into fossil fuel companies since the Paris Agreement, their CO2 footprint, the CO2 footprint of the entire portfolio, is most likely sizable, to say the least. And now I took a look at some of the Facebook posts you shared over the course of the last week, and I think they're all incredibly interesting. So I'm not taking them apart. I'm just trying to find ways of maybe applying what we just talked about. And the post on the left is about the 10-year anniversary of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And what I would find interesting personally is to see if there's maybe someone you can find who was part of the cleanup program, who was a witness, who was directly affected, or maybe even somebody who works for history for that Facebook page that produced this video, because maybe they would be willing to record a video of themselves being open about the fact that this was maybe one of the saddest videos they ever worked on. And I know that all of these ideas are pretty long shots and that they're most likely very research and work intense. So something that might be a bit less work intense and easier to achieve is looking at BP's ongoing extraction programs, or even programs they have planned, and coming up with a map of that and saying there's no guarantee Deepwater Horizon is not going to be repeated, because this is where BP is still active, and this is where across the globe similar disasters could still take place. And on the right, there's a Facebook post, a Guardian story, where we at Urgewald were actually quoted because the EU Commission chose the world's largest asset manager, Blackrock, as an advisor on environmental and social governance issues in banking. And let's say we were baffled because BlackRock is just the worst choice anyone could have made in this regard. And maybe you can explain why that's the case. And we have data on that. We have data on how many and with how much capacity coal companies and expansionists BlackRock is invested in. And BlackRock is the world's largest investor in fossil fuels and one of the leading global financiers of the weapons industry. So how could they advise the EU Commission on environmental and social governance? And the last example, this article I thought was also really interesting. It's about a locust plague that is up to 20 times larger than the last wave and that could devastate parts of East Africa. And maybe you could find someone who can give you a local expert view on that, somebody who works with a local university, somebody who has been affected because they're a farmer or they've witnessed this. Maybe you can even find similar stories across the globe to indicate that this is part of a much larger crisis, obviously. So yeah, this brings us to the next part, which is something I'm really excited about. It's the idea of becoming a digital Sherlock. I already mentioned a few of these things, but maybe now that you have a lot of time, presumably, to do research at home, you could try to find experts who might be willing to shine a new light on an existing story or reveal information that hasn't been made public yet. Maybe there are witnesses you can talk to, and you can encourage, if they're comfortable with that, to speak at a digital press conference that you organize, or a webinar where you can invite fellow activists and organizations, but also journalists. Because although most journalists are currently probably preoccupied with coverage of the COVID-19 crisis, just like you, they're most likely not going anywhere at the moment. So chances are that if you can introduce them to someone they would otherwise not be able to get hold of, or if you can share information with them that is newsworthy, chances are that they're going to at least interact with the information you're sharing and maybe speak to you or read your emails and conduct an interview and maybe cover some of your stories. And don't forget that you're part of a massive movement, not just when it comes to making things more visible and raising awareness, but also when it comes to digging up valuable information and connections, because all of you have family members and probably colleagues and friends who, again, know other people who can maybe make introductions or who can help you do research. So you're not alone in this. Continue asking for help, and I'm pretty sure that you're already doing a lot of that, and form coalitions. And don't force yourselves to reinvent the wheel. If somebody has already done the research or found information, ask them if you can use it, if you can work together, if somebody can help you understand what you've just found. There are tons of universities and experts and other organizations who are probably more than happy to help you with that. And try to think big picture and connect the dots. I think one local example can be a great way of illustrating something more complex, like in the case of highlighting or illustrating why fossil fuels have such a bad impact on the planet and the environment. But if you can find several similar examples across the world where something is going wrong, you may be onto something big. And don't forget to involve local partners, because they can give you firsthand witness accounts. They're experts in their local field, most likely. And also don't forget to involve the local press. And I'm going to share an example after this to describe why this is key of our campaigns at Urgewald. And I think one of the most powerful forms of rebellion is looking closer where big corporations and institutions want you to turn a blind eye. And the good thing is that most of the information you want and that you want to publish is already publicly available. It's in many cases just scattered, or it's hard to understand, or it's maybe hard to come by, or it looks incredibly boring while you might be looking at something really explosive. You just need somebody to explain to you what it is that you just found. And last but not least, facts and thorough research are key, and solid evidence will go a long, long way, just because they're so hard to ignore. If there's something that is really solid, that proves that you realize that something is going wrong, it's just going to be so much harder to brush off. And especially if you want to share things with the media, even if you don't have the capacity to double and triple check something, or you don't have a second source and you can't verify whether a resource or a link you found is authentic, be transparent about that and mention it, and then allow the journalists to do their own research. And here's an example of a story about a different bank, not one of the UK banks we were talking about, that I found really fascinating. So for those of you who missed Melinda Janke's talk on Wednesday, she was talking about this huge oil and gas development program in Guyana, because one of the biggest oil and gas discoveries was made off the coast of Guyana a few years ago. And after that, the World Bank got involved and basically provided tens of millions of public assistance and technical assistance to the Guyanese government to help extract and sell the oil. And the leading oil company in this is ExxonMobil. And one of our researchers, pretty much by accident, found out who the law firm is that is going to rewrite the petroleum laws of Guyana, because that information hadn't really been publicly available. And one of the local media outlets in Guyana basically just published the name of the law firm and not much else. And she came across it. And we realized that that law firm that is going to rewrite the petroleum laws of Guyana, paid for by the World Bank, hired by the Guyanese government, is the same Houston, Texas-based law firm that has been working for ExxonMobil for the last 40 years. And if anyone asked me to explain what a conflict of interest was, this is what I would use as a textbook example. So we shared the story with The Guardian, who published a piece where they shared even more information they were able to dig up, which was amazing. But it wasn't until the local press, after we also shared the story with them, started publishing piece after piece, finding and adding their own information. And these are just 4 examples of the, I believe, 6 or 7 articles they published over the last week. It wasn't until the local press started to really get involved in the story that we realized that maybe thanks to this, the perception of the oil and gas development in Guyana and among the Guyanese people had maybe changed. Because up until this point, for several different reasons, there had hardly been any criticism, local criticism of the oil and gas development. And there hadn't been that much information regarding the World Bank's involvement, ExxonMobil's role, and potential conflict of interest. So we're hoping that now the people of Guyana are maybe going to question whether this law firm that was hired by their government and paid for by the World Bank to revise their country's laws, whether that law firm is going to have their interests in mind as people of Guyana, or rather the interests and profits of its long-term client, ExxonMobil. And to round things off, we thought this was also something we should let the World Bank know. And when they held their digital AGM last weekend, they also held an online press conference and live streamed it on Twitter. And we were among the first accounts to comment on that live stream. And we shared all of the information. So we told them about our findings. We shared the videos we produced after a fact-finding mission in Guyana. We shared links to the coverage that had resulted in our publishing this information. And we asked other people to also get involved and share our findings. And we publicly questioned the World Bank's public pledge to stop financing upstream oil and gas after 2019, because there's so much evidence of ongoing budget support of this massive, massive oil and gas development program in Guyana. And this brings me to the final slide, because what is something that is really convenient at the moment is that big corporations, politicians, financial institutions, etc., are currently competing for the same space as you. Of course, there are still invite-only board meetings and shareholder meetings and press conferences that you might not be able to access. But apart from that, all these live streams are accessible to everyone. And you can use that because this is the space where all these big institutions are trying to brush up their reputation. And I think that's a very good space to insert yourselves into the conversation, ask critical questions, and share evidence. So if there are any public Q&As, any press conferences, and you have the opportunity to be critical and to say, this doesn't really add up, and here's why, this is the space to do it. And again, you can coordinate to get the most visibility for your comments and questions. You could also try to hold counter press conferences or record videos of yourselves where you elaborate on your findings, where you share your demands, and where you invite journalists, because chances are that journalists may be looking for a second opinion and a different angle. This was it. That was a lot of talking on my behalf. If you have any questions, I would love to hear them. If we shouldn't be able to cover all of them right now, you can contact me at jc@urgewald.org or on Twitter. But for now, I'd love to hear your questions.
I have a first question for you personally. Have any of the banks ever responded to your campaigns that you did online?
That's a good question. In some cases, they have, when we've given webinars or held digital press conferences, they have joined and just listened, which I think is a very, very good sign, because what we essentially want to do is not bash anyone. We want to start conversations and we want to offer our expertise to maybe help work them on a policy that is going to be solid. And something that happened today in case of German investors is that after months, if not years of campaigning, 2 German investment managers or asset managers, if that's the correct translation in that case, came out with really, really, really good policies. And we hope that that's a result of us trying to engage with them. When it comes to social media, they've been most likely, or they've mostly been relatively quiet. So we haven't really received a lot of responses under our social media posts, but I don't find that very surprising.
Do you have any advice on how to collaborate between different big movements and different movements in different countries in terms of digital activism?
Very good question. I think in terms of practicality, use the tools you're already using at the moment. So use the tools that allow you to coordinate. Use, for lack of a better tool, unfortunately, and I'm not a huge fan of Google and the monopoly, the monopoly position they're in, but use Google Sheets to link to Facebook posts or comments you want people to interact with, because that's something everyone can do from wherever they are, and you can leave pretty straightforward instructions. Apart from that, try to coordinate regarding how much potential is there for every campaign and what do you want to achieve? Is there a campaign that is kind of almost over the edge already and all it needs is a little more visibility or push, maybe an outside perspective? But because sometimes it can be more efficient to have outsiders comment on something to achieve movement within. So maybe that's something that could help. So maybe try to decide whether you all want to focus on the same thing or if you want to divide yourselves into smaller campaigns.
Are there different advantages to different social media platforms? So would you, let's say, advise to rather use Twitter for a certain campaign and Facebook for a different campaign?
I would definitely, if you want to reach out to journalists and connect with other organizations, I would use Twitter and LinkedIn. LinkedIn is actually a pretty brilliant platform if you want your content to be seen by professionals, by journalists, by other campaigners, other activists, maybe even the people working at banks that you want to interact with. Whereas Facebook is, I believe, a good platform if you want to reach a lot of people who are up for watching longer content, longer videos, etc., just like YouTube, for example. YouTube is actually also a very good channel if you want to advertise. And Instagram, since it's owned by Facebook, the ads can be run at the same time. But I think in terms of reaching the right people who might be able to answer your questions or work with you, I would rather focus on Twitter and LinkedIn.
How can we raise awareness after the AGMs are over? Because right now, obviously, we are doing that campaign against HSBC. We're doing the same thing for other banks too. But how can we continue our campaigns after the AGMs?
Start with that list of fossil fuel companies and projects the banks are invested in, because there's just so much information there and so much that could even be turned into its own little campaign that you are most likely not going to run out of content, at least. And that's also a good place to see if there are any anniversaries, if there are any local protests, for example. When it comes to the Alberta tar sands, you could see if any of the local groups are organizing protests also online to try and support them or add more information to that. So I think that would be a good place to start, because unfortunately, the banks are invested in more fossil fuel companies or financing more projects than we can really cover for the AGMs. So just keep choosing from that.
Larry Fink, he came out, he's the CEO of Blackrock, and he came out saying that climate change will now basically determine Blackrock's investment strategy. However, as Urgewald has also shown, that new policy that Blackrock came out with is only covering about 20% of the entire coal industry. So that Blackrock is basically, or Larry Fink is basically greenwashing. But at the same time, should we see him as an ally? Because he said that it will now determine Blackrock's investment strategy.
I think it's always a good idea to try and see people as allies, because that makes it easier to work with them. And if Joe Biden should get elected in the US presidential vote election this year, chances are that Larry Fink is going to become his treasurer, and that will put him in a position where he has even more decision-making power. I do somehow believe, and I do not know enough about him or the entire campaign, but I do believe that some of his approaches are genuine. However, as you already pointed out, BlackRock is still the world's largest investor in fossil fuels, and also still a financier of Raytheon, which is the US-based weapons company that is basically responsible for a lot of the weapons that have been used in the war in Yemen. They're also invested in BAE Systems, the EU's leading weapons producer. They're also invested in Rheinmetall, etc. So they're still a company that has such a long way to go. And basically what they did with their policy was get rid of the coal industry that was not profitable anymore anyway, while asking the world to celebrate BlackRock as a forward-thinking company. However, you mustn't forget they're also the world's largest asset manager. They manage, I believe, $7 trillion worth of assets. So the fact that they moved may have an impact on the others. And we didn't expect them to move first, just because they're the largest.
And do you think big investment managers like BlackRock, they knew what they did when they came out with a new policy that was actually quite weak?
I would assume that they didn't, just because that means that you can start a conversation. As Heffa already pointed out in her presentation yesterday, I believe, you can imagine the banking industry as a pretty uninformed herd of sheep. You is to assume that once they have the information that you have, they might be willing to make different decisions in the future. At least the more sheep, the more people you can talk to, and the more people you can educate, the higher the likelihood that the policies may change in the future. At least that will give you an in when it comes to starting a conversation. So I would just operate from the perspective of they didn't know what kind of impact their investments were having.
I think a good question to close this webinar would be to focus on the current situation. So you've already kind of mentioned how to get attention during Corona and during the crisis, but could you maybe elaborate on that a bit more?
If there's something you're working on that is either related to the COVID-19 crisis, and a lot of topics in this field are, just because there are stimulus and bailout programs in the US, in the EU that are currently being discussed. And the danger is that a lot of fossil fuel companies that would have died anyway, even without the Corona crisis, might now end up being bailed out thanks to these debt purchasing programs and stimulus packages. So I think a lot of the work that we're doing is more relevant than ever. And if we can find proof of that, if we can find data or new arguments that haven't been entered into the discussion yet, that's something that can be newsworthy. A lot of the research also shows that there's a correlation between air pollution and worse outcomes of the disease. And I think since it's shareholder season, there are still a lot of things that can't be ignored by the media because they are still going to report on a few things. And if you can offer something new, then I would suggest that you try to do that and you reach out to the press. If you can't offer anything new, I would maybe recommend that you don't try to do anything in that regard and focus on another story, even if that might mean waiting for a few days or for a few weeks. But I really do believe at the moment that it's harder than ever to get attention. Apart from if you have information nobody else has, obviously, then it might be possible for you to reach out to journalists. And I think what is important is that you maybe try to build a relationship with journalists so they know that they can trust you and that you're going to hand over well-researched information and data. So the better they know you, and I know that this is hard. It's hard to be in PR in that case, but if they know that whenever you reach out to them, you maybe have something interesting, it's easier for you to maybe get something in times like these. One last thing, and that's where I think you should make use of the fact that there are so many of you, because like I said earlier, chances that somebody will know someone or something interesting are really high. And this is how you could maybe make use of the fact that you're such a big movement and that you can reach so many different people.
Urgewald is also a great resource for you to inform yourselves, and if you've got any questions, you can always email the Urgewald people, and everybody will always be happy to give you more in-depth information. So just encouraging you to contact anybody of us if you ever want to have more in-depth information. Other than that, thank you so much, Jacey, for joining us. Thank you for giving that amazing webinar.
Thank you so much, everyone, especially on a Friday night. Really appreciate it.